Um, as I say, glad to welcome everybody here. We have comrades from nearly all the continents of the world here, and we know that this is a very important discussion for us. Among the flood,
What? Oh, it's not that it's also
among the flood of uprisings and unrest throughout the world. Perhaps one of the most spectacular was the nationwide, island-wide uprising last year in Sri Lanka, which went by the name of the aragalaya. I won't say any more about this. I'd like maybe to come into the discussion later, but we're very, very privileged to have Comrade Danusha here, who is a serious political commentator and economist, and who played an active part in those events. And Danusha, if you'd like to open up. I think we'll be also another comrade is will be coming to share your lead off. But between you, if you can be about 25 minutes to half an hour maximum. Um, and we'll open it up for discussion and questions with plenty of opportunity for everybody to participate. And of course, Tanusha, for you to answer questions and to respond to the discussion in a summing up. Right, I'll hand over straight to you, Tanusha, if you're ready.
Yes, thank you so much, Comrade Roger. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much for that introduction. I would hope to give you a brief overview of the economic crisis that took place and the key factors which contributed to it. And then I would hope to say a few ideas about what happened during the political uprising and the current situation. So, of course, maybe you all would be knowing that there is, of course, the neoclassical explanation about the Sri Lankan debt crisis that it triggered because of mainly the tax reductions and money printing that took place during COVID, and also the reduction in tourist incomes and the events that followed after that. But of course, new data and information surfaced during the crisis and also a few years before. And so I just would like to say a few things about those factors. Mainly, as we know, the crisis is in both the left wing and also the right wing is highlighted as a debt crisis. So now, recently there was a Auditor General's report that came out, which gave out some startling figures about the Sri Lanka's foreign debt situation. And so the Auditor General's report basically revealed that roughly around 67% of the foreign debt which the country borrowed between 2006 and 2021 does not reflect in the assets of the government, but 100% of that is reflected in terms of liabilities. So, I mean, as we know, as a basic accounting principle, that the assets and liabilities should match in value. But what we see is that 67% between this year. So if I give you more detail about these figures now, for instance, between the years 2006 and say around 2011 and 2012, around 80% of the debt is not reflected in the assets component. And so what the Auditor General is basically saying, this is mostly due to the overinflation or higher costs that were recorded, whereas the assets do not reflect the expenditure that was incurred during the year through during these 15 years through foreign borrowings. Say, for instance, if I give you another example, now in 2021 there was a highway that was constructed and finished between Oman and Saudi Arabia. The per kilometer cost was below $1 million. That was somewhere around $0.9 million. And whereas there was a highway that was constructed and finished in 2011, which is called the Southern Expressway. And in 2011, the cost was close to $6 million per kilometer. So, I mean, if we add also the inflation into it, because the highway in the Middle East was finished about 10 years before, about 10 years after the commencement or completion of Southern Expressway in Sri Lanka. And still the cost is 6 times greater. So if we add the inflation, this would come out to about 7 to 8 times. So, I mean, that itself shows the level and the degree of misappropriation of foreign debt. So going by these numbers, some of the activists and left-wing, especially the left-wing activists, have been very vocal about this issue, trying to push the idea of odious debt, and that this debt should not be paid by imposing these draconian taxes that currently the government has implemented through the budget, and also the value-added taxation that came into effect from January this year, which they have expanded into a broader network of goods and services. And some of the goods and services are only some of the goods and services are only produced within the country, and imports have been exempted. So, which also reflects this colonial tax policy of taxing the domestic production while allowing imports to flow free. So, encouraging and basically and even amplifying the foreign exchange crisis, I should say, currently Sri Lanka is facing. So, that is a one key factor, I should say, the misappropriation of the debt. So, and mind you, the total value of this debt comes to around $41 billion. So that is in rupees, it is around 8.2 trillion. As we know, the exchange rate has fluctuated remarkably, or depreciated significantly between those 15 years. So if we take the dollar value of the misappropriated debt, that comes to around $41 billion. And currently the Sri Lanka's foreign debt is around 50 billion. So over 80% of the actual debt that is recorded in government figures, we can say that it comes under the concept of odious debt. So what odious debt concept basically says is that if a government borrows on behalf of a population, or on behalf of a people, and then misappropriates that debt, not in the best interest of the people, and therefore the people is not the responsibility does not lie with the people to repay this debt. So then we have been pushing for a further investigation of what has happened and who has of course the money has gone into individuals' hands, especially in the private sector, and also with the political elites of the previous establishments and also the current establishment. So we can't expect anything out of the two major political parties that have been sharing the government office for since independence. So and also another key aspect is the capital flight that has been happening, I should say, since the mid-90s, when the current account was liberalized. As we know, there was a wave of neoliberal policies, that resurgence of neoliberal policies during the early 90s across the world, which of course Sri Lanka was also not spared. I think that was the phase where liberalization happened even at a greater rate compared to 1977, where the first phase of liberalization took place. The new neoliberal policies took place in 1977, but after that, it was the early 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed and the class power of the capitalist class increased, and as a result, we saw a resurgence of these policies across the world, not just in Sri Lanka. But in Sri Lanka, what happened was there was a great liberalization of the current account. So imports were mainly, the taxes imposed on imports were mainly lifted, and as a result, which also created the space for capital flight through the trade account, what we call transfer pricing and over invoicing and misinvoicing, these type of activities. And the reports came out early in 2022, highlighting some of the startling figures. So there was a report by Global Financial Integrity, and they showed that roughly around US $40 billion has been involved in these illicit flows. So so we know that misinvoicing happens in 4 ways. There is over invoicing and under invoicing in both exports and imports, and so most of that flows we can highlight as outflows. So if I give you an example, say for instance in 2021, when the industrial output was collapsing around 8 to 10%, there was a great increase in the imports of raw materials, like from 100% to 200%. And even in some cases, like chemical products, there was increase in about 300%. So we of course know, I mean, if industrial output is collapsing, there is no logical reason for imports of raw materials to increase by that margin. So that was we have been writing about that. That was a clear sign of over invoicing of imports and capital flight through the trade account. And so these issues we've been highlighting right throughout. So some of these issues, in fact, surprisingly made even onto IMF's proposals or IMF's recommendations to the government. Well, one in the form of tax evasion. I'll come to tax evasion a bit later. So, for instance, there was this governance diagnostic report that was published by the IMF a couple of months back. In the executive summary itself, they highlight the fact that Sri Lanka's foreign debt has been largely misappropriated, and not just misappropriated, the misappropriated funds have left the economy, and that the current administration is absolutely taking no steps whatsoever legally to investigate what has happened and also to reclaim these funds or repatriate these funds. So it's IMF itself actually highlighted these things. Of course, they are just on paper, just to show rest of the world that they are democratic and so on. But these recommendations are not legally or binding. I mean, let's say the government does not really pursue these recommendations, IMF will not, on the basis of that, cancel the ongoing extended fund facility. But they would do that if the ongoing privatization program and also the increase in indirect taxes, if these things are neglected by the government, and the cost reflected pricing, which has increased the essentials by 4 to 5 times, especially the fuel, electricity, water, you name it, all the government utilities have increased in price by 4 to 5 times as a result of these policies. And there was a increase in the interest rates also by a large margin, especially initiated by the central bank, but they have come down recently. So these things made it into IMF recommendations, I think, largely because of the political uprising and also the pressure from the public. These, although not in these numbers, there was a large belief or widespread belief that the debt has been misappropriated, and most of this funds or the foreign exchange that should have come into the country has been illicitly flown out. So these ideas were there even without the support of the numbers from, say, Auditor General and other international organizations which have done certain studies. So I think as a result, these ideas or these factors came into or reflected in IMF reports. And then secondly, thirdly, I should highlight the issue of tax evasion. And so the tax evasion is so large in Sri Lanka that it comes to roughly around 1 trillion rupees at the moment. And the government is doing absolutely nothing to reclaim these funds. And at the same time, is right now taxing even the essentials, or increasing the indirect taxation and causing inflationary pressure in the country, in the entire economy, and as a result, reducing the living standards, or basically not just reducing it, the living standards are at a critical level, critically low level, where right now you can see, and that there is a widespread resistance to government policies that I can say clearly, and there is absolutely no mandate to this on government, despite the lack of protests and so on. But there is ongoing protests everywhere right now in the country, like in small. Now, recently there was an absolutely large protest just by the Ceylon Electricity Board workers. About 10,000 of them gathered into Colombo a couple of weeks ago. That was to resist the privatization, ongoing privatization effort of the government. And so I could very clearly say there is a large resistance and disillusionment of government policies, and right now the public is suffering under the economic policies, especially the neoliberal economic policies conducted by the government. So I think those are the three key points. Now, tax evasion, of course, have a large impact on government debt also, because we know that if that is a clean source of income which should have come into the government accounts, but as a result of evasion, and also the fact that the governments are not capable of cutting their expenditure once this is approved, so they will have to increase their borrowings, and the cost of tax evasion is accumulating each year, because we have to calculate the present value of that. Say, for instance, now this 1 trillion in evaded taxes had happened throughout the last 9 to 10 years. So what was evaded, say, 10 years ago, the value of the current value of that is much more greater. So I'm only highlighting the nominal or the current figure which the Inland Revenue Department has revealed, not the actual present value. So the impact on so for instance, that is, if we say the current value of that is around roughly 1.5 trillion, that is greater than 50% of the interest expenditure. That is far greater than 50% of the interest expenditure which Sri Lankan government will be paying in 2024. And also I would like to highlight a very recent phenomenon that happened largely because of domestic borrowings. I think I have about 7-8 minutes, so I'll just try to finish that quickly and say a few things about the aragalaya. So
that's fine, Comrade. And I see that Comrade Swastika has joined us too. So, Swastika, you take over once Comrade Danusha has finished. Okay.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
Sorry to interrupt.
So just to say another important thing about Sri Lanka's debt and its interest expenses. Now, currently, Sri Lanka pays, now in 2024, Sri Lanka will be paying 77% of its government revenue for interest expenses. And around 95% of this interest expense will be going to finance the domestic debt, not the foreign debt. Largely because right now, and even if largely because right now, because the commercial debt and also bilateral debt is Sri Lanka is currently not paying because of the default which happened in 2022. But we are financing, Sri Lanka is financing the multilateral debt. So the interest expenditure on multilateral debt is very much low. But even if we take, even if commercial and bilateral debt repayments restart, the interest expenses will not shoot up so much compared to domestic interest expenditure. This was largely because during 2022 and 2023, the domestic interest rates went through the roof, and they were around 30 to 35% levels. And through the domestic debt restructuring, which happened in September last year, they only targeted the workers' pension funds. But in fact, it was the private sector corporations and the individual elites who actually snatched up these high-cost bonds that were issued in 2022 and last year. So we have facts for data for 2022 that shows around 75% of that high-cost domestic debt was purchased by the private sector, say the banking sector, finance companies, the individual high net worth individuals, and the conglomerates. So still only 21 or 20, roughly 20% of that was purchased by the workers' pension funds. So the government only targeted the pension funds in the domestic debt restructuring. And completely exempted the high-cost bonds that were purchased by the business elite, largely the business elite in the private, obviously in the private sector. So interest expenses have actually multiplied. So as a ratio, this was around 35% of revenue in 2015. That has shot up to 77%. This is the highest in the world, mind you. And the second in line is Ghana, and Ghana is only paying 44% of their revenue as interest expenses. So we see the massive gap between Sri Lanka and second in line, that is Ghana. So which is again creating extreme issues, because that means that over 3/4 of the tax money is going to finance the domestic debt, largely the domestic debt, and it is going into the hands of a financial elite that is holding Sri Lanka's domestic debt like hostage. So that is intensifying. So we must also see where all this money is going after taxing the people to a level unbearable to maintain their essential living conditions, and all that, where that tax money is going, and that tax money is going to into the hands of an unproductive financial elite in the country. So I guess that gives like a sort of an overview of what happened in the country and what is right now happening in the economy. Not to mention that the production or the exports is collapsing, and of course it's backward structure, which is a common feature in third world countries and underdeveloped countries. So this just to say a few things about the political situation. So during the aragalaya, that was largely, I think, was the face of the aragalaya was the urban middle class, which was supported by the peasantry and, I mean, the farmers. But this was a largely an uprising centered in urban areas, which actually spread out, as Comrade Roger Silverman very rightly said, spread out right throughout the country. What happened there was that we can say that there was an extreme shortage of the essentials like fuel. There was like 12-hour electricity cuts, and also extreme price increases in domestically used cooking gas, things like that. So the middle class couldn't continue their usual way of life, which was very so-called consumerist, so that was basically the uprising was mainly a demand that was centered on demanding the going back to the way of life that was there before the crisis, not like a systemic or systemic political uprising demanding a change in the entire system, but yes, those characteristics were also there, like demanding the end of corruption and so on. But it was triggered through these lack and skyrocketing prices of the essentials. So this coincided with the spike in world market prices of oil. Say, for instance, a barrel of oil was around 60 USD in 2021, which shot up to around 140 with the Ukraine invasion by Russia in around February. And similarly, the price of coal went up about 8 times, and also the natural gas went up by similar times. So, and this also coincided with the default that happened in April 2022, and large evaporation of the foreign exchange reserves, and then people who are remitting money to the country, suddenly all that money dried out. So with that, the political upsurge happened, and so it was largely a middle class based leadership, where all the classes, basically all the entire population took part in the aragalaya. I can't see anyone, I mean, apart from a very staunch hardcore supporters of the Mahinda Rajapaksa regime. Apart from that, largely everyone supported. So right now, of course, there is a serious demand for politics where it is corruption free. So there is some space opened up for more out of the box so-called lefting thinking. There's some opening up in the public, or let's say there is more acceptance of these type of ideas. So compared to what it was a few years ago. So there is an opportunity, but of course we right now in Sri Lanka there is only this what we call NPP or the JVP that has come to the front. We can't say it's entirely a left, but it has a left-wing history, but it has.
I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you short, but
your time is okay. So maybe just to say that there is some hope for Sri Lanka in terms of some significant political change, but the political parties at the moment that has come up as a result are not entirely reflecting those demands that is coming through the public. So with that, I would like to conclude, and thank you so much for having me and for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Darusha. Very comprehensive and exhaustive exploration of the economic background. I'm now very happy to welcome Comrade Swastika. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Raja.
Oh, yeah, there you are. Sorry. Comrade Swastika, let me just introduce you. She is the leader of one of the independent trade union federations. I think the United Federation of Labour, and she will, if you like, take us now into the political aspects and and give some more of an insight into the movement that took place in the working class and within the society generally. Comrade Swastika, over to you.
Thanks, Comrade Raja. It's really nice to be here amongst so many like-minded comrades. So since Danusha gave a very comprehensive picture on the economic issues and the economic structures, I thought maybe I can tie it up with the political structures in Sri Lanka and what really caused the crisis and what actually led to the uprising in 2022. Now, lots of commentators focus on individual events which happened few years back, like for instance, when the president at that time decided to cut taxes. He brought about an agricultural policy where from chemical agriculture, he suddenly transferred the agriculture. He made orders, executive orders to transfer it to organic agriculture. So these are individual instances or examples which people usually point to say this is what caused the crisis and this is what caused the people's uprising. But I would actually trace the crisis of Sri Lanka back to the 1970s, where Sri Lanka was one of the first South Asian countries to liberalize, move from a state-centric, state-led economic model to a free market liberalized model, where we embraced neoliberal economic policies full and full. And the issue, I think, at that time was Sri Lanka is yet to become a fully industrial society. So we had a lot of feudal elements in our economic model and so on. So when the ground was not actually set properly, even if we take liberalization, for instance, when the ground was actually still getting prepared to become industrialized, suddenly when you open the market, that was a disaster in the making, and it of course took 40 years for people to come out in this form of uprising. So Sri Lanka was one of the first countries in South Asia to liberalize, to embrace neoliberal economic policies. And the president at that time chose to use certain political tools in order to push through this neoliberal agenda. One of the things he did was he changed the constitution. Up until that point, we had a parliamentary system where the prime minister was the sole deciding person, or not the sole deciding person, but the prime minister was accountable or responsible to the parliament. In 1978, the president at that time, the prime minister at that time, J.R. Jayawardena, he moved the system from a parliamentary democracy to a presidential, or to a system where it's like a hybrid between a parliamentary and presidential system. And what that did was it concentrated state power in this one powerful executive president. So essentially, when the 1978 constitutional amendment came, the Sri Lankan president became the head of the cabinet and the government. He could prorogue parliament and dissolve parliament, and he was also appointing the judges of the superior courts. So there is this one powerful executive president who was controlling the parliament, the executive, as well as the judiciary. So that concentration of power, when we look at society, when we look at political structures, it sort of contributed to the erosion of any kind of accountability in our political structures. The other thing the president did at that time was trade unionism and workers were well organized up until the 1970s. So they were well organized because it was a state-led economy. There was a lot of state-owned enterprises, and they were highly trade unionized. So in the 1980s, there was a historical strike called the general strike, which happened in Sri Lanka. And the president at that time crushed the general strike, dismissed the workers who participated in thousands, dismissed the workers who participated in the general strike, and basically broke trade unionism and trade union movement in Sri Lanka. And we are still recovering from the 1980s general strike and what happened to the trade union movement. We never really picked up. So with the crisis happening right now, I think there is a bit more interest with younger workers to unionize and so on. But up until this point, the trade union movement remained very weak because of the huge setback which the trade union movement faced in the 1980s gender strike. So labor was weakened as part of this neoliberal economic policies. And other thing which the president did was, Sri Lanka was also one of the first countries in South Asia to pass a counter-terrorism legislation, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which gave vast powers to the executive to detain people without having to produce them in court. So we passed the Prevention of Terrorism Act in 1978, and anyone and everyone who opposed the government was brought under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. So this was the start of the neoliberal, setting the neoliberal order in Sri Lanka. But of course, due to labor movements, due to left activism, due to worker struggles, due to peasant struggles, the government was unable to push through the neoliberal reforms, which we usually see in other countries: weakening labor, deregulation, privatization, financialization. This did not fully happen in Sri Lanka. It was like halting and coming to a pause and then moving forward and so on. So the government was never able to properly push it through. And then what happened? We have the 2022 economic crisis, where the entire country came to a standstill. We had borrowed too much. For 30 years, we were on a war economy. And in 2007, I believe, for the first time, the government went to the international sovereign markets and borrowed, and debt eventually piled up. And then we came to a situation where we had to declare bankruptcy. So now Sri Lanka has declared bankruptcy, and the government tells us we don't have any other options but to go to the IMF. And for the IMF, this is like a golden moment being given in a platter, where we are led by a government which also wants to rush through these neoliberal policies. And then the IMF comes in and tells us, we are recommending to Sri Lanka a governance diagnostic. You have a very, very weak governance structure, which is prone to corruption, which is prone to abuse of authority and so on. So we are proposing governance diagnostics. And what does the IMF propose? It proposes anti-corruption legislation. It proposes to make the central bank independent of the parliament. We call the central bank independent today, but the central bank is independent of the people, but it is not really independent of the businesses in Sri Lanka. So we have the so-called independent central bank right now. The IMF is saying your state-owned enterprises are loss-making, so you need to sell them off and give it to private ownership. So the government is selling off assets and selling off public services like the electricity service, transport service, telecommunication service, and so on. And then, of course, weakening of labor, where the government is now mooting a new labor law reform, which basically crushes any kind of right of workers to trade unionize, or make it impossible for workers to trade unionize. So all of this is happening. And in addition to that, just like what happened in the 1970s, 1978, the government is now bringing the next phase of the anti-terror legislation, where they're proposing a new anti-terror legislation, where they have proposed an online safety bill, which essentially curtails freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and the right to campaign and advocate for change online, where it criminalizes online activism and freedom of expression and so on. So this is the kind of ground situation we have when we look at the political structure. The executive, the presidential system, we are still stuck with it. The president still remains the head of cabinet. He can still dissolve the parliament, and he can still appoint superior court judges and so on. There are few checks and balances which have been brought along the years, but the power still remains concentrated with the executive presidency. So this is kind of the political, kind of the constitutional political structure. But Sri Lanka also, many of you would know, Sri Lanka also went through a 30-year-long ethnic conflict. Race remains a very decisive, divisive factor, which divides class struggles. So when we go into a class struggles, race becomes a very, very fundamental factor in Sri Lanka, where it divides working class, it divides Sinhala workers and Tamil workers, and now even Muslim workers. So race is, when we look at Sri Lanka's class structure, race becomes a very, very dominant, divisive factor amongst workers, which have been a huge problem in terms of uniting the working class, because the north and the east of the country, where the civil war was predominantly fought, where the Tamil minorities live, the north and the east is still kind of stuck or staying still in the post-war phase, where thousands have gone missing during the conflict, which happened, which finished 13 years ago. But the struggle to find family members who have gone missing is still alive. The struggle for wartime accountability is still alive. And that remains a very strong sentiment amongst people in the north and the east parts of the country. So that is on the ethnic conflict. But also, we also have another population, the indentured workers who are brought from India with the British, who are in the tea plantations, which is in the central part of the country. So this year they marked, or rather last year they marked 200 years since the indentured workers or the plantation workers were brought from South India to work in the plantations of Sri Lanka. Their economic and social conditions remain horrendously, they live under very horrendous and very, very poor economic and social conditions. They work under slave-like conditions. Many of them still live in line houses, which are owned by factory owners, plantation owners. So they still don't have the right of a house and the right of a land in the plantation in the central part of Sri Lanka. So these are kind of the ethnic and the what shall I say, the overarching issues or divisions within society in Sri Lanka, and which contributes to divisiveness amongst the working class. So I will just stop with that. Just one more thing about the 2022 uprising. 2022 uprising was essentially concentrated or based in, it was based in the capital city of Sri Lanka, which is Colombo. And one of the reasons why the uprising became a powerful and then it moved into a people's movement is because we were able to sustain occupation movement in one of the most prime lands of Colombo, where initially it was started off by a group of middle class youth, and then left political parties came and supported it, trade unions supported it, student movement supported it. So it kind of picked up momentum. But one of the drawbacks in the occupation movement, or the aragalaya as we call it now, is that it did not have a political direction. It did not have a political leadership, ideological leadership. So it was no right or left, or we did not, the entire movement did not know in which direction it was going. So the only thing which it managed to achieve in the end, which is what it started off for also, is to get rid of the incumbent president at that time. Now, despite the fact that that is the reason, the entire protest was called Go Home Gota. Gotabaya Rajapaksa was the president at the time, and the protest movement was called Go Home Gota. So it did achieve that. It did send the incumbent president home, but it afterwards left a void as to what was to be done in the next step. And that resulted in the current president coming in. And then we are facing what I would term a kind of like the counter-revolution, where workers are being crushed, poor people are being crushed, and the entire burden of the crisis are being put on ordinary people of this country. Thank you. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you very much, Comrade Swastika and Comrade Danusha. I think that's been a really brilliant opening to our discussion. I'm going to call on anybody who wants to speak. I would like at a certain point in the discussion to vacate the chair to make a contribution. If Pam, I believe, is ready to take over as chair. But I first of all, who wants? Please, ask any questions, make any comments. I see David and Andros have their hands up. David?
Well, look, first of all, thanks to the comrades. It's marvelous to see you, as well as to hear the reports from Roger, about the work that you're undertaking in Sri Lanka. And, we've learned a lot from your contributions. Can I say that, from a distance, what, we are seeing, or at least I'm seeing, and maybe others too, is, one of the most advanced sort of welfare states in the third world being ravaged, by austerity, then calamity after calamity with wars and uprisings, which all crushed, an economic catastrophe, and yet there's still the burning embers of resistance. And all of this is it's huge, huge change, but not necessarily, certainly not in a straight line. And I just want to make some points and add some questions, in this, in my contribution, and hopefully start some levels of debate. What it seems to me from a distance is something comparable to the states in Africa, not the welfare state. We've never had anything approaching a welfare state in any of the post-colonial states in Africa, but a neo-colonial state, a state which is weak against large capital and weak against the flow of capital, and which has pretensions about liberating and becoming sort of socialist or sort of welfare or sort of in favor of the people. But after a period of crises, ends up in naked oppression of the people with what has been described as a Bonapartist regime. In other words, the executive being elevated above society, the ruling class or the ruling strata exchanging, political positions among themselves, among families, and so forth. A tiny club of the elite which manage all, the political positions of power. And I imagine also those are the pretentious capitalists. I mean, they're not capitalists because they actually do not accumulate capital and invest in capital, but they act as clients for all kinds of states. It's capital in general, because now we have Chinese capital as well as the IMF, the World Bank, India, Japan, and elsewhere. And as I understand it, now China is the largest loaner to Sri Lanka, although this might have changed in the most recent period. I see originally it was something like 19%, when Japan was somewhere at 9%, India somewhere 7%. And the geopolitics is tied up with the flow of finances, but all to the mutual ruin of the working class. So I'm particularly interested. We had a discussion last week about the Belt and Road Initiative, and I know that there's a lot of interest and some controversy about the Hambantota port, if I've got it right. Apparently, that was the home area, for one of the previous presidents, and it was a kind of connectivity project to link, world trade, particularly the trade by Chinese, carried by Chinese vessels or those linked to Chinese trade, to dominate the whole of the southern, Pacific. Now, apparently, and I'd ask the comrades to please come back on this, this has not succeeded because the boom which was anticipated didn't take place within Sri Lanka, certainly not a boom in Sri Lanka. And for some reason or other, the Chinese investors have not succeeded in bringing that port into the frame of their general circulation of goods and materials, throughout the regions. But what does also, become clear when we look at the debt question is that we're looking to the working class in India, particularly, but also in China, because what are we seeing? What we are seeing is, as in Africa, the movements of the working class are, we have to say, quite limited. Even though they might be very militant, our South African working class is second to none in terms of its strike ability, its resistance to apartheid and to capitalism. But that is taking place on an isolated basis, even though we're a middle-level country, because we are not totally linked up with the struggle internationally. Capital is moving at the speed of light or electronically, and yet the working class is stumbling to be able to establish even the basic connectivity. And so I want to ask the comrades what links are being made between the movements as we are right now with India and other parts of the continent, the region, and internationally, so that you can rebuild and renew the strength during a very difficult time. Just one point, Jen, to conclude on. What I do think we've seen with the economic catastrophe is enormous increase in inequality, an unreformed government and unreformed political parties. So we have the same as before. And how are we going to break? The question I raise is, how are we going to break the existing reformation of political formations in the old image and create something new, which is actually the working class in action? Thank you.
All right, thank you, David. We've got a number of comrades indicated they want to speak. Andros, Amaya, Huat, and Nikos. If I could abuse my position by putting myself next on the list after them, and of course there'll still be plenty of time for other comrades. Andros.
Am I audible? I hope I'm audible.
Is Andros? Are you there, Andros?
I'm here, but Comrade Maya seems to.
Oh, okay. All right, Maya, you go now.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Comrade Maya is an Indian comrade, by the way. Carry on.
Yes. So some of these observations that I am sharing here are also, observations which, while talking to comrades in Sri Lanka, these have been shared earlier also. And I just wanted to, bring those out and reassert them. Because you see, the functioning of the ruling elites and dominant classes in Sri Lanka and the imperialist, neoliberal agenda of international bodies like the IMF and World Bank, they're very well known. And we discuss them several times within progressive activist, circles. We need to discuss is the deadlock, the deadlock that the movement eventually went through. It's still caught in. And here, I'd like to draw attention to the fact that, what was the signaling effect that this movement had? Where did its uniqueness lie? It lay in the fact that, it had this very strong anti-systemic thrust. And it created a massive legitimacy crisis for the state. And, the aragalaya has, it drew in a very, very crucial way, it drew a lot of attention to the question, namely of who rules and the question of how such rule is managed. So, ultimately, coming out of the entrenched economic crisis, which Comrade Dhanush has very vividly explained as a crisis that continues, or basically, let me say, a new, better future is attainable only people's control the economy in Sri Lanka. And such control over and reorganization of the economy demands a radically different political system. And somewhere the movement, aragalaya, was moving in that direction. It was actually that people had that sense that they need a complete overhaul of the political system to get out of the crisis that the economy was undergoing. So, it becomes crucial, therefore, for us to discuss the question of the political form of the alternative that, that was there, fleet there in the aragalaya, in the movement. And, that question is really linked to the larger concern, then we see these potentials in movements as they unfold. What is the role of the left in ensuring that those revolutionary, circumstances actually then translate or lead to, a class struggle after the initial outbreak, the initial, coming together of, different forces. So here my observation is, and I'm bringing this to the discussion. I've written about it also and shared it with comrades in Sri Lanka. The left failed. The left failed to put forward a comprehensive strategy. Of course, the left had an important role, and it was, part of the uprising as it unfolded. But then in terms of building that alternative, once you've seen the initial outbreak, once you've seen, people come out and get, and get a receptivity to a certain idea of change, what did we then do wrong? Talking in vague language, the left in Sri Lanka, unfortunately, was, floating this idea of a people's council. And I'm very consciously saying people's council in singular. And it was actually an idea which was so vague that it was very easily co-opted by the Wickremesinghe government, because Wickremesinghe, started talking about a people's assembly, Now, the people's council in singular basically amounted to, the fact that we're actually envisaging at a time when we've created a huge legitimate crisis for the representative parliamentary system, we're actually slipping back because you are limiting the collective wisdom to is just another singular consultative body, like a bicameral structure. There'll be another chamber known as the People's Council with representatives, from certain quarters, right? And it would not have changed. It would have lacked the autonomy. It would have lacked the kind of initiative and self-rule that a multitude or a network of people's assemblies. The alternative was people's assemblies, and there was actually a receptivity to the idea of self-rule being multiplied across and not just limited to the initial site of the occupation in Colombo, but actually generalizing the struggle. So rather than a people's council in singular, the discussion, the debate, the initiative, the strategies could have evolved around people's assembly as a format of dual power, which allows for a multitude of centers of people's self-rule across Sri Lanka and of resulting, contestation with the repressive ruling establishment. So I would say wherever Aragalaya's forces were the strongest, wherever the left forces were the strongest, that's where we could have at the local level built these, people's assemblies. And these could have, transcended into the more advanced people's councils, right? And on various issues and in various sectors, we could have captured and precipitated the crisis for the regime. So it was really about seeing the potential of the movement, the kind of crisis in moving people, some struggling masses, which included the working class, away from representative parliamentary system towards people's politics, where people make decisions. That's where you begin to generalize and actually build a framework for self-rule. So, and this became important also because we have to remember that the working class is never a unified, whole. It's divided along racial lines, it's divided along religion, etc. So you can't, anyways have a political strategy that's going to, seek to galvanize working class only in their workplace. But we need to, galvanize them in their neighborhoods, in villages, wherever possible. And we also have to remember that it's only in the process of, the working class, being continuously involved in movements and struggles that facilitate their self-rule, that actually a formidable unity going beyond, divisions of all kinds materializes, and class consciousness begins to, materialize. So I'd just like to share that, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Maya. Very, very important contribution. Andros, are you ready now?
Yes, Roger, thank you. And thank you to the comrades for their very enlightening introductions and contributions. I want to raise some questions, but I should start by saying that last year's uprising in Sri Lanka was really inspiring. And we followed it from abroad. We are in Greece. We are we belong to the Greek left, but I'm sure people all around the globe followed it with extreme interest. And it was one of the tens of social eruptions that we saw in the past few years in many countries in the neo-colonial or ex-colonial world, which did not succeed in their aims. I mean, we had revolts in some cases with clear revolutionary characteristics, but none of them was able to complete this process of social change or successful revolution. And this, of course, also happened about a decade ago, a bit more than a decade, when we had the Arab uprisings in the Middle East, which were full-blown revolutions, but they ended up in civil wars and dictatorial regimes, etc. So the first question in my mind, listening to the comrades, is what is the state of the working class in Sri Lanka today? Comrade Swastika described the developments after the uprising as a counter-revolution. She also said something very important, that the Sri Lankan working class is still trying to recover from the defeat of the 1980 general strike. Of course, this was coupled with the collapse of the Soviet Union that Comrade Danusha mentioned before, which took everything backwards. So we had the working class trying to get out of a defeat, and then we had an uprising, but we had a defeat of that uprising. So what's the state now? What's the mood? And how is consciousness developing? I mean, is it a dominant feeling of demoralization, or is there a feeling of surge to build something? And then this is linked to the question of the left. JVP has been mentioned. My knowledge of the JVP is that it's a big left party with very nationalist traditions. So, I mean, I would be interested to know more about the left in general and how they intervened in the uprising, and what did the JVP do about it. And if there are, inside the JVP, because of the outcome of the uprising, if there are, let's say, divisions, if there are sections of the JVP which are looking for a way out. And then there is also a question in my mind about the relations between Sinhala workers and Tamil workers. I mean, there has been a civil war there, so what are the relations now between these two sections of the working class? There is a final question, which I don't know if there is time to take up, because that's a big issue in itself, but it's the relations with China and the feeling of the masses to China. David mentioned that China is a big lender to Sri Lanka. I know that Sri Lanka has not been able to pay back some of the debts, and as a result, some of the loans, and as a result, China took ownership for 100 years of one of the new ports that she assisted financially to build. So what's the mood towards Sri Lanka compared to the, what's the mood in Sri Lanka people, the popular layers towards China, and what's their mood towards the West and the IMF? I hope I didn't put too many questions on the table. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you. A number of questions there. We've got Hewat, Nikos, Finn, Ian, and me on the list. Okay, in that order, please. Comrade Hewat.
Yeah, I found the expositions of Comrade Danusha and Comrade Swastika. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly. Swastika. I found it amazing. And I'm from Namibia. There are a whole lot of parallels of what they have explained. The exposition of Comrade Swastika was amazing in the sense that it was historical exposition of the development of the class struggle in Sri Lanka. And that was really amazingly done. It was very fluently done. And this is a discussion, I think, that should continue. It can't just be completed tonight. the question of the national debt. We are a population of 2.6 million. It's about 10 times less than Sri Lanka. One Namibian for every 10 Sri Lankans. But our national debt is already 12 billion US dollars. And there are no assets. It went straight into the pockets of the comprador state here. And this is it seems to me that what Comrade Danusha explained is a sort of similar situation in Sri Lanka in this regard. But the question of national debt without any obligation from the lender to take responsibility for what purpose he gives this money must be considered and must become an issue of struggle alongside the demand for the national regime to account for what happened to the debt, because that is definitely one serious mechanism through which the comprador state is completely put in the pocket of imperialism. Now, as far as I'll just make short statements on this. The problem that I find with the revolutionary struggles is we tend not to concentrate on the central issue, and that is the issue of the question of leadership, working class leadership. The situation in Namibia is that the working class has not yet lost, it has not just descended into complete defeat. The militancy is still there, but it lacks a leadership. And the question of working class leadership is neither practical nor a theoretical struggle, which is essential if one wants to build a revolutionary movement. And what happened in this country is that the capitalist, the colonial regime, and the US imperialist and the Western imperialists used pre-capitalist, feudal and tribal social relations to weaken the organization of the working class and to use it as a main attack on the working class leadership. Just as in South Africa, those same formations were used over the length of the struggle against apartheid to attack the working class leadership and to weaken it. And what was weak was the theoretical struggle against these attacks, and rather a capitulation to these counter-revolutionary tendencies by the left. So the outstanding issue, and the outstanding that must be very conscious in the left if the working class wish to be strengthened, is to fight the issue of the leadership of the working class. In Namibia, the working class is still militant, but because it lacks that leadership, the struggle is rapidly being weakened. And now an additional element has come in, Chinese imperialism, which is out to destroy trade unionism completely. And there is no functional proletarian leadership to fight against this. I understand that the issue of fighting for working class leadership is a very complex issue, and it must be waged by competent leaders, because this question is often bedeviled by sectarianism, petty bourgeois sectarianism, and given all sorts of distortions. But for the working class to go forward, and we are facing a situation where the working class is drawn into struggle, whether they like it or not, worldwide. Same issues in the semi-colonial world, and these issues are already manifesting itself in the imperialist centers themselves. This question is, in my opinion, the central issue today in the for the left to consider. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Comrade Nikos.
Yes, hi, comrade. Sorry, I hope you can hear me because we have 2 online meetings in this house. So internet connection is unstable. Thanks to all the comrades for the important contributions. A lot of things that are really interesting. I would just like to ask a question, because the usual problem when something happens in a country and it's been a focal point of political developments is that most of the information we get is from the bourgeois press, and there's not much information we get from the facts on the ground. So I would just like to ask comrades, I mean, I appreciate a lot of contributions on this field by both Swastika and Maya. If they could elaborate a bit more about the form of the protest. So what did the movement look like in terms of were there any like coordination bodies, or were there any council type bodies that emerged from this uprising, or was it just general calls for mobilization and people taking to the streets? Were there any discussions going on in any level, and how did they look like? I think it's important like to exchange experiences on this, in different uprisings and in different mobilizations. What is the form that the protests take each time, and what can we learn from each country and its experience, and how can we replicate the best things out of that? So if comrades can say a bit more about the form that the movement took, and how did it look like, I think it would be very interesting to us all. Thanks, comrade.
All right, thank you. Finn?
Comrades, I want to begin by thanking Danusha and Swastika for very interesting and very stimulating contributions. And there's a very, very wide range of issues in what both comrades have said. So I want to focus just mainly on just one issue, which is the national question as it relates to the Tamil and Sinhalese division. So it's a question and also some contribution I want to make on that. The capitalist class around the world exploit national divisions to secure their own position and to create divisions within the working class. It's not just Sri Lanka. We know it's in India, where Modi is using it to create divisions between Hindu and Muslim. It's been used historically all the time, right across the globe. Go back to the 70s, there was a division generated in Africa, in Uganda, between Africans and Indians. In Ireland, where I come from, we had our own problems, we still have to some extent on that issue, where British imperialism exploited religious divisions to create a dichotomy between Catholic and Protestant during the time of the struggle for independence from British imperialism. So it's a general issue which extends across the globe, which the capitalists exploit. I'm interested in how this question emerges, though, within Sri Lanka. So a question I want to ask initially is the consciousness and the awareness of this issue largely for the north of Sri Lanka, around places like Jaffna, where the Tamils obviously are in a huge majority, or does it emerge across the country, Sri Lanka? So is the question of Tamil, the Tamil issue live across the whole of Sri Lanka? There was a terrible record, of course. There was, I understand, something like 50,000 Tamil civilians were killed between 1983 and 2004. And in addition to that 50,000, many tens of thousands others were disappeared. That's an expression we also have in Ireland when people were killed by the IRA and were never found, because use the expression disappeared. but there must be a terrible record there. And I'm wondering, is that consciousness there across Sri Lanka? I mean, Bandaranaike would have had a terrible record in that regard, I'm sure, along with other leaders which emerged at various times in Sri Lanka. The question was also raised of ethnic division. Swastika raised this question of Indian workers living in slave conditions on plantations. I'm interested in the demands. What demands are being raised and should be raised with regard, well, initially, obviously, what demands would be raised with regard to the Tamil unresolved national question? Incidentally, there's many unresolved national questions across the globe. It's not just Sri Lanka. There's an unresolved national questions in Europe, places like Spain, to some extent, although Ian obviously knows a lot more about this than I would. In Scotland, the issue of Scottish independence, which is an unresolved question of national identity, it emerges and recedes. At the moment, it's receding, but at other times it was a dominant issue. So it's not gone, it's an unresolved question. There's unresolved national questions in places like Morocco as well. So this issue is generalized, but I'm interested to see or to hear what demands should be raised by the left with regard to the Tamil question. I'm referring to the possible secession of Tamil independence in the north of India. I don't know, you see, what demands are issued. And with regard to the ethnic division, which is a different question somewhat from the national question, how is this issue being faced up to? And is there support amongst the organized working class across Sri Lanka for the organization of these Indian workers on the plantations? Now, it's largely questions, and it's relevant to many, many countries. It's not unique to Sri Lanka, this issue of the unresolved national questions across the globe, and what demands and what issues do we raise to make workers in general more conscious of the specific national demands of minorities within the various countries. So the questions are directed largely at Swastika because she raised it, but any contributions Collins wish to make to illuminate that question, I'd be very interested to hear. Thanks, comrades.
Right, Ian.
Hi, thank you. And apologies for being late. First of all, we had a visit at the house, and I'd forgotten that the discussion this week was on Sri Lanka, or I'd have tried to get away sooner to catch the introductions, because it's an uprising that's fascinated me for a long time and inspired me a lot, as I'm sure others. I must admit that I'm surprised. I think 18 months on that, as I was coming in, somebody said a very unreformed government, indeed the perennial losing presidential candidate that the president who was driven out appointed as prime minister and then ascended as acting president from a parliamentary party, I believe, of one, has clung on this long. So I've got a few questions, and apologies if they've been covered in the lead-offs. But the presidential and parliamentary elections, even on the normal timescale, must be coming up soon. Is the left, I heard a JVP mentioned, are they planning to intervene in that? Does the JVP perhaps thinking that they could come to power in that way on the tail end of a movement and then being elected in a more reformist way, which has had obviously very mixed results, some decent ones in Latin America, but some very bad ones, like in Greece with Syriza coming to power. But I'm also very interested in the national question that Finn was just talking about. One of the most inspiring things to me about the uprising was that so soon in historical terms, after a really terrible end to a terrible civil war, there seemed to be workers' unity across Sinhala and Tamil communities, and I'm very glad that we've got a Tamil comrade speaking today about this. That from what I know, and correct me, comrades on the ground, if I'm getting any of this wrong, but from what I know about the Tamil Tigers, they were a totally unsupportable group, nothing to do with socialism or anti-imperialism on a world scale, but trying to win independence and what presumably would have been a capitalist dictatorship under them by totally military terroristic means. but there is a real problem of national oppression, which presumably got even worse with the massacres and almost genocidal violence in 2009. So I don't know, but it seems to me at least Tamil autonomy, maybe even federalization of Sri Lanka would be a good solution, especially under socialism. Talking of which, Sri Lanka was one of the countries with the biggest Trotskyist implantation on the ground historically. Has that been recovered and grown again out of the movement, the uprising, or have some of the bad consequences of the LSSP participation in government and all the rest of it still not been recovered from? And one last specific question. I remember a few months ago on Channel 4 Dispatches, there was a very interesting program about how the Rajapaksas might well have been behind the terrorist ISIS bombings of the Christian community, the third largest religious community bombing the fourth largest, for the people who massacred the second largest to get the votes of the first largest to come back, because it was all about anti-terrorism and they were strong on security. But it seems that some of the things that conspiracy theorists, so-called, often allege are in this case, we've got chapter and verse, they're bang to rights. So has that energized the situation again on the ground? You'd think that if that kind of revelation came out about a political elite so soon after a uprising, even a stalled or defeated one, it would lead to some blowback. So what's been the response to that from the movement and in Sri Lankan politics? Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Ian. There's nobody else with their hands up except me. Pam, do you mind taking over sharing? I think this has been a really very, very good meeting, and I think the comrades have really enlightened us on the situation. I want to make just a few points, putting it in the context. Comrade Hewitt raised the crucial issue, which is a crucial issue for every discussion that we have, which is this question of leadership. And I think it's important to note that in Sri Lanka, this is a particularly relevant point, because it's one of the few countries where there was a mass revolutionary party at one stage. And in fact, the first political party to be created in what was to become Sri Lanka, in Ceylon at the time of independence, the very first party to be created in Sri Lanka was a Trotskyist party, the Lanka Sama Samaja Party. And it did play a huge role in the fight for independence and in the development of society in the early years of independence. In 1953, they organized a nationwide uprising, a hartal, which is a kind of general strike plus insurrection, if you like. It was a huge movement, and soon after, it was it actually entered the government, and of course, this is where the decline began. And the same old story of popular frontism, of a left party getting into alliances with parties that were out to destroy and undermine them, and it led to defeats. But nevertheless, the Popular Front government that existed between 1970 and 77, I think, was it introduced quite substantial reforms. Sri Lanka was very different from the other countries of South Asia and of most of the countries of the colonial world. There was free education right up to university level. There was a health service. There were all kinds of reforms which would have been almost unthinkable just across the strait for the population in India, for instance. But what happened is with the collapse of the Popular Front government and the rise of authoritarian right-wing parties. At that time, the UNP, United National Party. At that time, with these looming defeats ahead, you had a split in the LSSP, and the Navasama Samaja Party came out of that, which was for a short period a genuine mass party, and it led to the general strike, which comrades have referred to. Unfortunately, the leadership was simply not up to the job. It didn't do proper preparations. It went into it without a proper plan or a proper strategy, and it led to it was a genuine general strike, and it did paralyze the economy for a time, but it led eventually to a complete defeat, absolute catastrophic defeat. It led to the blacklisting and dismissal of 40,000 trade union militants, trade union activists, and really everything that came, the horrors that came after that, all really can be traced to that defeat. And we then had horror after horror for 40 years. We had already had the JVP uprising in 1971, which was a kind of blind, toying with kind of guerrillarist or Guevarist kind of delusions, but at the same time it was a thoroughly communal and nationalistic movement and an anti-Tamil movement. It got its impetus from the frustrations of Sri Lanka youth who couldn't find jobs and who were blaming the Tamil population for taking away and denying them the opportunities and the employment prospects and so on. So you had that. And then you had, of course, the horrors of the 30-year civil war, of the uprising of the Tamil population. I'd like to say a lot more about that, but I don't want to take too much time. But then, in other words, you had civil war. You had another uprising by the JVP, similarly directed not really against the ruling class and the establishment, or not only, but also against what was left of the Labour movement. And there were many comrades who were linked to some of us here at the time. There were comrades who were assassinated both by the LTTE and other comrades who were assassinated by the JVP in the communal horrors, in the bloodbath that Sri Lanka became for those decades. And it was out of that you got this absolutely horrible, disgusting Rajapaksa regime, which comrades have mentioned. And as Ian said, there was that very interesting program which showed that having gained their credibility by defeating the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers, in other words, having already ridden the wave of one wave of communal vengeance, if you like, they then deliberately cultivated and promoted this Muslim terrorist group, and directed it not against the Buddhist majority, but against another minority, the Christian minority, as a very, very clever attempt, which I think really fell flat, in order to try to give them some credibility. But then you had what is absolutely inspiring is that through all these defeats, all the disappearances, all the horrific repression that came from the government, the massacre at the end of the Tamil War, etc., and so on. Through all of that, those traditions of revolution were not completely crushed. And when comrades say about the leadership, the point is that what is inspiring is that there was still some of the embers were still burning, if you like, despite all the bloodshed and horrors and massacres of the previous generation of suffering. And the aragalaya was, I think, was a huge inspiration. Now, comrades have quite rightly said, well, yes, we didn't have a program, and it was just, it wasn't really aiming at a change in society. But actually, what revolutions have ever begun with a conscious slogan on their banner of overthrowing capitalism and establishing a socialist society? They come always from particular hardships which have galvanized them, which have spurred them, which have impelled them to take action. And that's what happened here, that despite everything, it was the political level, as comrades have said, was almost non-existent. I mean, it was simply a protest against the collapse in living standards. I mean, real starvation, which, and a complete seizure of the economy. There was seizing up of the economy. There was no petrol. There were power cuts for 12 hours a day. I mean, there was a complete collapse of any kind of civilized existence, and people went on the march, and they rose up, and they simply marched. And they had no program, they had no political goal. It was simply their slogan was "Gota go." Gota being kind of a nickname for the president. Gota go. And that, if you like, part of its strength was that it wasn't organized, if you like, that there was no leadership was trying to channel it and to curb it. But of course, it was also its weakness because it didn't develop any kind of program beyond Gota go. And what happened is that Gota went. And when Gota went, then they had no program to follow it up and to actually institutionalize or build on the victory that they had. And therefore, we see now, as comrades quite rightly say, you now have a situation where they have, if anything, their living standards are, if anything, well, certainly as bad, or if anything, worse. I know that comrades are hardly managing to eat more than basic rice and dal, and not much more. I know that comrades are unable to switch on their electricity and their electric fan because they can't afford the bills and so on. People in established jobs, I'm talking about, people even with quite responsible jobs, are driven to absolute penury. And nevertheless, what is so inspiring is that the new generation is coming up, which is still prepared to fight. And I mean, if we wanted examples of that, the personification of that is comrades Danusha and Swastika, who are here today, who are from a younger generation, who didn't go through the defeat of the general strike, who didn't see the collapse and betrayals by previous militant left parties, the NSSP and then later the NSSP, and nevertheless are taking up the fight. And I think comrades, I was very impressed, I'm sure all comrades were, by the political level and political insight and understanding that these comrades have shown. And I think it's because the revolutionary traditions have still not been completely expunged from the DNA of Sri Lankan society, that they're not defeated. And what is significant again is that, yes, comrades, I think people are demoralized now. People think, well, we did all that, and what did it lead to, or what have we got? But I think what we also have to bear in mind is, one, they were not defeated. There was no, there was very few casualties, deaths, imprisonments, repression, and within the very, very, very limited goals of the movement, it actually succeeded. They said "Gotta go" and "Gotta went." So I think what we'll see is that when people are driven once again to take up the struggle, and I think that is not far ahead, then they will have learnt from the experience. They'll say, look, we did succeed in getting rid of one president. What went wrong last time is we didn't have a clear program. We didn't know where to go. And I think it's very clear. I believe there's lots of evidence that that a layer of, particularly of a younger generation, is beginning to think about and to draw those conclusions. Just one last question. Comrades have mentioned about the JVP. The JVP has now taken a turn. I think there's a parallel to what happened with Sinn Féin in Ireland, that they've in effect, they have a kind of militant aura around them because of their guerrilla heritage and legacy, but actually now they're completely I'd say even to call it a reformist program would be perhaps an exaggeration, and they're desperate to get into government. And I think it's possible that in the coming elections, which are due in a few months' time, that a coalition, including the JVP, may well come to power. But it will not achieve any more than if the same thing happens in Ireland. It will not actually lead to any material gains or benefits in any way from point of the population. But there is a split. There's been a split in the JVP, the Frontline Socialist Party. There's actually one of their members lives in London and has been coming quite frequently to our WIN meetings. Pity that he's not here today. But actually leading members of that party are in discussions with us or with other of the comrades who are there. And I think they've led a split on the basis that the JVP has abandoned any trace of socialism in its program, and that it needs that what is needed is a proper program which can take the revolutionary potential, can bring it to a conclusion. I won't say any more now, but is there any other comrades who want to come in? Pam.
I just wanted to say something quickly. I was actually in Sri Lanka just before the aragalaya. I actually came home a week too early and missed it, unfortunately. But after that, I did follow it quite closely on the Sri Lankan English language news. It was just what Roger was saying about repression. There was quite a considerable attempt to repress the uprising. There was copious amounts of tear gas use, of water cannons, of arrest. There was huge campaigns by lawyers to get people out of jail again. But what you saw that people were absolutely courageous. You know, the quip I heard was, "Don't worry about the gas. They'll soon run out of foreign exchange and they won't be able to buy any." And that was just a remark I heard. So I'm not thinking it's quite true to say they didn't try quite hard to repress it. Perhaps put it more on temporary hold. But I mean, people were absolutely amazing. They were just, this is including monks dancing in front of the water cannons and picking up gas canisters and throwing them back and stuff, which was quite something that was reported on the news. You would never get that amount of detail. The British news, that everything's much more heavily censored. So just the thing I wanted to say, really.
Yes, I mean, well, my point was simply that I don't think people consider it a defeat. I don't think. I mean, it was not like the crushing of the general strike, for instance, in 1980 in its effect. Comrade Nimrala.
I have put down 4 questions on the chat, so you can have a look at
chat. Let's see.
I can't actually see them. Have you sent them?
Oh yes, can I read them out? I can see it here. Or do you want to speak? Do you want to read them?
I don't need to speak. I mean, you know, you can. The speakers, the 2 speakers from Sri Lanka can address them. I'm putting the questions to them actually.
Yes, but let me read them out so comrade, or can all comrades see them? Let's just read them. I have several questions. 1, this is election year. Do you think elections will be held? 2, recently the American ambassador tried to get the UMP and SJB back together again to form one party, as the JVP seems too strong for their liking. Your opinion on this? 3, the agreement with India to hand over Trincomalee Harbour and surrounding area to form a free trade zone there, resulting in the eviction of Tamil, Muslim and Sinhala people from that region. Where are we at? And 4, the formation of people's councils. Do you feel that they are in any position to pose a united resistance to the rapid legislational programme at the bidding of the IMF to disenfranchising the people at present? Right, good questions. Who wants to go first? Nimrala, Swastika or Danusha? Oh, Kieran, do you want to speak? No. Okay.
No, sorry, that's an error.
Okay.
So
right.
I will. Danusha, you want to go first?
Swastika, yes, please.
Okay. So just to there are many questions, but I will cluster these questions and try to be as succinct as possible. So there was a lot of interest in the JVP and whether the JVP would be, whether the JVP is actually, whether we consider the JVP a left party, and also what are their chances in the elections and so on. It's a little early to say as to their chances in the election and as to how much of parliamentary seats they are going to get and so on, because so far JVP, which is now called the National People's Power, NPP, it has been the only party which has been campaigning for elections. I mean, their political program, the entire political program is geared towards election is coming, and we should capture power through elections. I mean, they don't have any other political program. So they have been the only party which has been campaigning even without an election being announced. So they are campaigning for an election, but there is no election being announced. So because of that, in polls and so on, JVP or slash NPP seems to be leading in the polls. Like recently, there was a poll where the NPP leader got like 51% of popularity vote and so on. But it's a little hard to say at this point because there is a lot of fear amongst the status quo parties, including the UNP, the Sajaba, which are more of the right-wing parties or neoliberal parties, so to speak, that the JVP will come to power. So it's a little early to say, but they have been definitely pushing to capture power, and because that has been their single and only political program. But I would not call the JVP left, particularly at this point, because they have formed this new coalition called the NPP, which is geared towards gaining middle-class votes, which does not have an alternative proposal to the IMF reform package, and which also supports many of the reforms which are being pushed through. For instance, privatization is happening. The electricity, telecom is being privatized, and the JVP, we don't really see the JVP or its unions being on the forefront opposing privatization or deregulation. So the JVP has moved very far from its origins, where it was kind of seen as this left nationalist revolutionary front, which was fighting for change, so to speak. I mean, there are many interpretations, but at least they had kind of a left beginnings. But now they have moved very much away from that. And at best, now they could be called a center-left party. I mean, the left party is a bit weak, I would say, but it can call more of a central party. So even if the JVP comes to power, we won't see a left coalition or a left party coming to power. It would be more of at best, it would be a center kind of party being in power. Maybe some of the neoliberal reforms which are being pushed through now may be reversed, but I highly doubt. For instance, Sri Lanka has prided itself for having a free education, but for instance, JVP supports the notion of private colleges and so on. So it's a little early to say in terms of them rising to power, but even if they do, I don't think it's going to be a left government. There's also a lot of interest in the race question, and what now after 30 years of war, what now? Thousands of people have gone missing and so on, and what now in terms of class composition. So the race factor has always been a factor where the capitalist class or the ruling elite have been able to divide the working class, and that working class have not seriously addressed this question, or trade unions, left political parties have not seriously addressed this question, including the Frontline Socialist Party. So the race question, until the war was going on, it was a very contentious one, where you had the left or the left political parties taking the nationalist line, and therefore a very, very anti-Tamil racist line. And now, since the war is over, they don't want to deal with the question at all. They would be like, okay, let's all get together. Why are we talking about the past? Let's forget about the past and get together. So they don't really want to really look into where the left went wrong in terms of the national question and where we stand now and how are we going to move towards the future. But in terms of the Tamils who are mostly living in the north, and one of the comrades asked whether it is a national-wide national question or is it only concentrated in the north and the east. The north and the east politics have the north and the east part of Sri Lanka, where the concentration of Tamils are. The politics or the political elite in the north and the east part of Sri Lanka have managed to retain this political dialogue on national question to a point where we don't discuss in the north and the east part of Sri Lanka. We don't discuss so much the economic problems, so to speak. So it's all about the national question. It's all about self-determination, and we need to resolve the national question before we move into anything. Even if people are dying with no food, no, we have to resolve the national question. And I think the reason why the story in the North and East remains stagnated there is one because the state remains very much Sinhala Buddhist racist. So it does not allow for any questions of the national question or to question of resolving the national problem to happen. So then the Tamil population living in the North and East becomes more and more defensive on this question. And also the political class or the political representatives of the Tamils living in the North and the East also find it a very easy card in terms of winning elections and so on. So the question, the national question to date remains very divisive. It's not as strong as it used to be during the war, because when the war was happening, there was an urgency to talk about it. Now that urgency has gone. So it's kind of like a thing which is there. It's floating around in political conversation. Once in a while, it rises up. During the Easter Sunday attacks, the anti-Muslim rhetoric was high on the rise and so on, but it never gets resolved. It's just there. The left also does not want to really address the question and so on. So it's a bit of a sad situation. But in recent times, particularly since the aragalaya, there has been some openings to talk about what happened during the war, the kind of death and destruction which happened during the war. And there was a I would say in a very, very small sense, a bit of reflection amongst the Sinhala South as to what happened to the Tamils and what racism did and so on. And some of the trade unions, including my trade union, we take forward that conversation with the working class. Despite the fact that the economic questions and the crisis, the economic crisis is like the predominant conversation now, we always manage to bring the race question and tie it to the race question to see if we can come up with a solution. In terms of my opinion on it is that we have to move towards larger power devolution. It's not only for the national question, but also for the rest of the country. We have to move away from this concentration of power in the executive to power devolution to the districts. And I think that would, to some extent, resolve many of the questions or many of the political grievances of the Tamil-speaking people of the country. In terms of the aragalaya and whether people think we won or lost the aragalaya, I think the aragalaya, as I think Roger was saying, since 1980s up to 2022, we didn't really have, I mean, we had sporadic protests and so on, but we didn't really have young people raising political questions, asking the question about the system and the status quo and so on. And that actually happened with the aragalaya in a very limited sense, but it happened in the aragalaya. The landscape of the aragalaya was based in Colombo. It was initially led by a group of middle-class youth, but eventually it started getting support from trade unions, from workers, from student movements, from religious clergies, and various other people, from peasants. So it started gaining momentum and support from various groups in society. And I think that is what resulted in the final uprising which overthrew the president. So it's not a black and white question as to did we win or lose the aragalaya. Of course, beyond overthrowing the president, concretely nothing happened out of it. But people were also talking about this concept of People's Council and how the concept of People's Council came out of aragalaya. Initially, it was just one People's Council, as Maya was saying. But now the Frontline Socialist Party, which is a breakaway party from the JVP, which is the only left party, I would say, popular left party in Sri Lanka, they had taken this idea of People's Council and they have been establishing People's Council in various districts across the island, in Jaffna, in the upcountry, and so on. So that has a potential of evolving into engaging people in political questions, which we did not have before. But it's still at a very rudimentary stage. It's still being formed and it's still at a very rudimentary stage. So it's too early to say. But there are things like People's Councils, People's Movements. Then, of course, trade unions are forming groups called the Workers' Councils, because we're not allowed to form trade unions in, for instance, the export processing zones. So we are forming Workers' Councils and having political discussions with workers. So these little initiatives are going on, but it's yet too early, because 2022 was the uprising, and then the government came and completely crushed it with military intervention, and then we were not allowed to have any protests on the street. Tear gas, police battening, you name it, everything. I mean, we were not allowed to protest on the street. So it's still like kind of budding, is still too early to say. But I think the aragalaya kind of shifted young people actually engaging the question of power and politics and so on, which is I think not a bad situation for the country. Going into Nirmala's questions about elections and whether UNP and Sajaba was kind of like the breakaway party of the UNP. What we are seeing right now is that members of parliament who are sitting in the Sajaba party are now moving back into the UNP because they see Ranil gaining popularity or power or whatever. So it's still very much where these right-wing parties are, members are moving here and there. It's still very much in terms, it's a state of influx. We might see a situation where the UNP, the United National Party, might come together once again when election comes. But right now it remains two different parties, but we are seeing more and more MPs moving towards the President's Party, which is the United National Party. The India taking over the east, particularly lands in the eastern part of Sri Lanka, the possible question of establishing free trade zone in Sri Lanka. There's a massive opposition inside Sri Lanka with regards to this. But my worry is the opposition tends to take a very nationalist kind of rhetoric. And then that kind of rhetoric turns against the Tamil minorities. India's intervention with the Tamil political question still remains a very, very kind of point with the singular nationalist. So whenever they talk about India, it's always a very nationalistic kind of discourse which is happening, which is very worrying for the rest of us, because any moment it can turn into a racist kind of narrative. So these are the larger questions. I hope I managed to cover everything. Something about the plantations. The last year marked the 200 years since indentured workers came to Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, despite the fact that the left in Sri Lanka did support certain economic reforms within the plantation in the early days, the left got co-opted with the government, and with that they also kind of abandoned the plantation workers. And since then, the larger working class in Sri Lanka have not really had a solidarity or a solidarity movement with the plantation workers. So they have been left to their own devices, and they have been left to fight their own struggles. But recently, last year, what we noticed was this kind of changing again. People have started taking interest in the plight of the plantation workers. And what we are hoping is that this would build into more solidarity action between other workers and plantation workers, which would finally kind of create a social, I won't say a social uprising, it's too early to say, but at least a change in economic and social conditions of plantation workers. One small thing which has been happening within the plantation community in recent time is the plantation leadership, or the leadership political leadership which emerged from the plantation community, have been framing the Indian Tamil question. They are called the Indian Tamil migrant workers. So the Indian Tamil or the plantation workers question as a national question. Like they want to identify the plantation, the Indian Tamils, as a nation. So the Sinhala nation, the Tamil nation, the Muslim nation, and now the Indian Tamil nation. And I find that that political framing to be quite worrying, because nationalism and dividing races into nations is what has resulted in this amount of bloodshed and destruction. And even after that, when plantation workers, the political framing which they're using for their liberation is nationhood, it's a bit worrying for someone who is outside the community. But it's not for me to impose my ideas on a community which has been oppressed for nearly 200 years. So we have to again wait and see. Many things are happening in Sri Lanka post Aragalaya, so we have to wait and see. Thank you. Dhanusha.
Thank you very much, Comrade Swastika. Dhanusha.
Yeah, thank you so much, comrade, for those comments. So it was all very enlightening, and especially Comrade Andos had, I think, about 4 or 5 questions, and most of them were covered by Swastika, and Swastika did, I think, a brilliant job in, I think, answering most of the questions. I think all of the questions. I just have very few things to add. Well, one question that I would like to take up is that Comrade Andos asked about the condition of the working class. So I think to comment about the condition, I think we also need to sort of reflect on what the business elite is actually doing, and how it relates to the rest of the economy, and how it's actually generating its surpluses, because it's an actually
a result of that process. So just to say a few things about that. So right now, what is happening is this what the classical Marxian notion of collapsing rate of profit, but of course not the way what Marx actually envisaged. He's theorizing that based on the development of production forces, but it's quite the opposite that is happening in Sri Lanka. There is no development at all in production forces, but the rate of profit is collapsing, as a function of the shrinking of markets and what is going on in the broader economy. So while the rate of profit in their own sphere is declining rapidly, their stranglehold of the government sector is strengthening. So what they're doing is, when the rate of profit is collapsing, they are entering into all spheres of the government, which was earlier reserved to the public. Say, for instance, privatization of the profitable companies. So while their own profits are collapsing, they are trying to grab the profits that was actually the public asset. And also, I earlier mentioned the interest component of the government, which is huge. And so 40% of the government revenue or expenditure is going into this interest. And most of it is snatched up by this business elite, and which is a very recent phenomenon. This happened during the last 2-3 years. So what we see is that they have also, while they have consolidated their position and consolidated and increased their strength over what is happening in government finance, there is also, on the other hand, the opposite is happening, a decline of surpluses in their own sphere, in the private sector. So as a result of all this, now I would just also like to a little bit go back a few years. So what I was saying is that there was a tremendous increase in the price of crude oil and other essential energy products like coal and so on. But then also there was a rapid decline, right? So while as a result of the rapid decline, of course, we saw the exchange rate collapsing almost 100%. And this has now appreciated about 20%. So we see with the decline in energy prices and so on, the currency also slightly appreciated. But then one could envisage that, okay, then we should see some conditions improving. But quite the exact opposite has happened. While the prices of the world market in these commodities have collapsed, now it went up to around 140. Right now, I think it's about $70 a barrel. So it went down as much as it went up. Similarly, we see that with coal and gas, natural gas, which are key commodities and key components of the import basket of Sri Lanka, which actually dominates the foreign exchange expenditure and also what is happening in the currency. So, but what we are seeing with the working class is that their conditions are rapidly deteriorating. While these prices of commodities are coming down, the opposite is happening in terms of inflation is rising. So to give you a few examples, now Comrade Roger very vividly explained about the electricity situation. So if I give you some numbers, now about 6 months ago, roughly 500,000 meters were zero. That means 500,000 households were cut out of electricity, which is 6 months ago. And about 2 months ago, this figure rose up to 700,000. So I'm talking now, when we say 500,000 households, this is about 10% of the entire population. Now this went up to about 700,000, which is again about, I think, 14 to 15%. And right now, when the current government, this neoliberal government, is boasting of stability, so this is what they call stability. They call stability, impoverishment is now referred to as stability. Basically, disenfranchisement of access to basic needs is framed as stability by this government. So there is a tremendous amount of anger. At the same time, of course, we also see some form of demoralization also, because after all the struggle and so on, all the people coming onto streets and facing bullets, what happened ultimately was strengthening of
of a neoliberal government. But at the same time, so right now there is more than 1 million households cut out of electricity, 1,060,000, which is unimaginable, because this is almost over 20% of the population. So imagine the crisis. I mean, this amounts, what it says is that 20% of the population is right now out of electricity. So I don't even know how they are managing. And then about the food situation, there was 2 months ago, there was a report done by, I think, the World Food Program. I do not remember who exactly the institution is. So 24% of the population is critically in need of support for food. I mean, they are not even meeting their basic. That is like, 1/4 of the population is cut out of essential food supplies. So this has increased over the past few months, which was 18 or 15% in the early 2023. So by around October, this has increased to 24%. So while conditions are deteriorating, what they're calling as stability is the stability in the external sector. This is what matters to them, because what they want, the government and the IMF and the imperial powers, what they want is rip off as much as they possibly can through taxes and pay the debt. And this debt has also gone into the hands of a few, right? As Comrade David very rightly explained, these are not capitalists. They are not accumulating capital. And as we know, the meaning of capital accumulation in Marxian terms is that there is division of labor and mechanization, and there's a dialectical relationship between them. And when the surpluses fall into that framework, only there is a capital accumulation. But there is nothing like that happening. So we can't call them capitalists. So right now they have entirely centered their economic program to repay this debt, which is illegitimate, or close to 70% of this debt is clearly illegitimate. That is what the Auditor General's report is very clearly saying. So, and there is well, there's no reflection about that from the government, obviously, because they are all involved in it, and also the business elite, because these government projects happens through the private sector, and as much as it benefits a few political elite, it even more than that benefits the business elite that is connected with the political establishment even more. So about the question about the working class, I should say, just to wrap this up, it is very difficult, because the classical working class consciousness, I don't know whether we can see that in especially in the third world, because the process of capitalist development is very much lacking, which happens through modern industry. And modern industry was completely was basically nipped from the bud during the British colonial period, and also this is the common experience of the third world. So any form of industrialization which took place during the colonial period was crushed through taxes. So that has resulted in a working class that has not experienced capital accumulation or industrial development, and it is that particular process that bring their consciousness together which is much more suited for a socialist communist transformation of a country, of a nation. So that development is lacking. The objective requirement of production forces that reflects in working class consciousness is lacking. So that we must clearly point out. But we see like certain similarities of what happened in Cuba, in fact. Now, Cuban Revolution was centered on the main rhetoric was centered on corruption. And of course, the working class played a massive role, but it was more of a populist struggle. And the coordinates of the struggle, the political coordinates of the struggle was in fact even determined by, not even by a political party, but an outside movement led by Fidel Castro, which he didn't have a political party during that period.
It was some July 26 movement or whatever that was called. I forget exact the name. So in Sri Lanka also, and also we know this is not a very popular idea, that corruption is like it's framed as if corruption is something endemic to this part of the world. It's something much of like a cultural entity that is dominating the flow of resources in this part of the world. But clearly the opposite. This also has very much colonial roots. So, and there's so much of studies done by the African left-wing Marxists and so on, not just, and which is a recent field of study, I should say. Like in the early 2000s, there are like these journal articles appeared that how colonial rule itself strengthened corruption. Now, this is not a residue of pre-capitalist form of governance, but corruption was instituted during the colonial period into the governance structure of the colonies, which is clearly documented by, especially in Africa, the writers, they have documented how the elite was formed through relations of power, and which can be categorized as institutionalizing corruption. And so, I mean, and that was in fact made into an argument or as an excuse to colonial domination. It's like the white man's burden. So, you know, these countries are all corrupt, these people are corrupt. So there is we have a moral obligation to set things right in the colonies. So, that heritage of colonial corruption, countries like Sri Lanka has maintained that and has actually developed on and extended. So so we cannot single out or isolate this issue of corruption from global capitalism and global imperial dominance. This is very much part of it. Lastly, so I should say the consciousness, the aspect of consciousness. Right now, there's tremendous attraction or openness towards more radical thinking, but I wouldn't say it is working class dominated because of because, you know, there was a resurgence of consumerist capitalist ideologies, especially since liberalization after 77, and also after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that multiplied, that really strengthened, and it was. The society was not ideologically prepared to take on the new challenges which it reads to, and right now I think it is slowly awakening. It's slowly coming up to face the challenge that it needs to be self-aware of the requirements, the political requirements of the immediate future. That cannot be sustained or that cannot be centered on consumerism. That was Sri Lankan society by and large until up to Aragalaya. And so, I mean, just to say, I mean, if there's a political party says, you know, campaign towards socialism, they will definitely lose. Now, that is the situation right now, even with this much of collective collapse. But there is still an opening for radical thinking. So I think that should not be limited to framing of it as socialism. If you are basically putting up certain solutions or certain ideas in an open way without labeling it sort of like socialist or communist, then I think there's some traction towards that by the society. So it's very difficult to say where this would go, but I completely agree and with what Comrade Swastika explained, where politically Sri Lanka is headed in terms of left-wing politics. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much, both Danusha and Swastika, and to all the comrades who participated. In my opinion, this is one of the best discussions we've had for a very long time. Particularly welcome the comrades, the contributions of the comrades from Sri Lanka and India, and everybody else, of course. I hope you'll all come to future meetings. We do meet every week. We're not quite sure what the topic will be next week, but you will get notification within 2 or 3 days by email. And do please all participate, because I think these discussions are absolutely invaluable. They're indispensable. We have comrades participating from, it's true, only 20 or 25 comrades at this meeting, for instance, but from all the, from 4 continents around the world. And I think the level of discussion was exceptionally high, and we're all learning from one another. So please do keep participating and bring your friends and comrades along as well. Okay, comrades, and thank you again. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.